This is a reading from the Diary of Jesus by Jean Aulagnier. Part 3. The Early Church, from AD 31 to AD 70. Asterisk. Remember, asterisk means that it was not gleaned from the writings of Maria Valtorta, but is probably coming from other sources. We know that the chief priests hated Jesus and deliberately plotted their actions against him and his followers in secret. The chief priests lusted after power and thought nothing of deceiving the masses. The Jewish people respected its priests and its God and was faithful to the rights of the nation. As a result, they were easy to influence. Saul, the fierce defender of the most legalistic form of Judaism, is the perfect example of an honest Jew who was deceived by the chief priests. Asterisk. The high priest and his radicals remained quiet for a few months after Pentecost because of Pilate. Emperor Tiberius had just taken Pilate to task for his attitude towards Jesus. For this reason, Pilate was angry with the Jewish priesthood. The priests became furious when they realized how deluded they had been when they thought they had eliminated Jesus. AD 31, the Jewish leaders spent most of the year setting traps for Stephen. They considered him to be their primary enemy from the time he had been selected as one of the deacons of the new church. Footnote 1, Acts chapter 6, verses 1 to 6 and 8 to 11. AD 32. Early in the year, AD 32, they decided that the time was ripe to capture Stephen and bring him before the Sanhedrin. Of course, his fate was already sealed, as had been the case with Jesus. They went ahead with the mock trial reported in the scriptures. Footnote 2, Acts chapter 6, verses 13 to 7, 60. Stephen was condemned and stoned to death. Gamaliel and his disciple Saul had a heated discussion on this occasion. Gamaliel disapproved of the violence and unruly attitude of Stephen's persecutors. He openly walked out of the room where Stephen was supposedly tried. Saul could not understand this. "What?" he said to his master. "You, the greatest rabbi of Israel, you protect these blasphemers, the followers of the Nazarene?" "I stand for justice," Gamaliel replied. "I do not want to stain my hands with the blood of someone who does not deserve to die." Saul was stunned. "But do you not fear the Most High?" He asked. "More than you do," Gamaliel reminded him of what he had probably told his disciples many times before. He had heard God's voice in the mouth of a 12-year-old boy 23 years earlier. The boy promised him a sign. This sign came to pass, which proved that the Messiah had come. Saul turned a deaf ear and went over to watch the stoning. Stephen, his former co-disciple, managed to tell Saul, "My friend, I am waiting for you on the way of the Messiah." Saul's hour had not yet come, and he kicked Stephen in the legs and insulted him. Acts chapter 8, verse 1a. The church in Jerusalem was much persecuted at this time. Nicodemus had remained passive throughout Stephen's condemnation, but he warned his fellow Christians that night. The Sanhedrin had decided to go through a carefully drawn list of Christ's faithful. Stephen, the young deacon, was only meant to be the first of many. After warning them, Nicodemus went with Mary, Peter, James of Alphaeus, John, and Simon the Zealot to get Stephen's corpse. Then they gave the martyr an honorable burial. Acts chapter 8, verse 1b. And all except the apostles were scattered about over the countryside of Judea and Samaria. Now Saul was in a murderous frenzy. He obtained the chief priest's authorization to continue persecuting Christians. Acts chapter 8, verse 3. Saul made havoc of the church. He would make his way into house after house, carrying men and women off and committing them to prison. Those who had been driven away spread the gospel as they went from place to place. The apostles themselves began fleeing. John, however, remained behind, since Jesus had entrusted him with his mother. Jesus' cousin James also remained behind, since Jesus had put him in charge of the church of Jerusalem. Even Peter did not flee, since he was in charge of all Christians. This made him the key man to deal with the Jewish leaders. Asterisk. The book of Acts tells us that Philip went to evangelize Samaria. Footnote 3, Acts chapter 8, verses 5 to 40. After this, the Lord physically blinded Saul on the road to Damascus so that Saul could gain God's supernatural sight. Footnote 4, Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 19. Saul's conversion, of course, only managed to enrage the chief priests. Sometime after converting, Saul changed his name to Paul. AD 33, asterisk. Peter began to operate away from Jerusalem. Footnote 5, Acts chapter 9, verses 32 to 43. He began evangelizing along the Mediterranean coast, especially in Joppa, present-day Tel Aviv. AD 34, asterisk. The angel of the Lord called Peter over to the house of Cornelius, the centurion of Caesarea. Footnote 6, Acts chapter 10, verses 1 through 48. Until then, asterisk, Christ's church had been unified. The mass conversions of uncircumcised pagans shocked many Jewish Christians. These Christians did not remember, or perhaps had never heard, Jesus' words on the circumcision of heart and spirit. See Sunday, April 28th of AD 30, page 297. Asterisk. Peter had to return to Jerusalem in order to explain this to the Jewish converts. Footnote 7, Acts chapter 11, verses 1 through 18. AD 35, asterisk. Now Paul was forced to flee from Damascus. He returned to Jerusalem, Acts chapter 9, verses 25 to 27, and found himself estranged. His former colleagues loathed him, and his former victims still greatly mistrusted him. A disciple introduced Paul to Peter and James. Footnote, Galatians chapter 1, verses 18 to 19. This was Barnabas, who came to believe in Jesus when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. See January 29th, AD 30. Meanwhile, Gamaliel went through something similar to Saul, though over a much longer period of time. His physical sight failed him more and more, while his spiritual sight did not cease to increase. AD 36. Important events affected Palestine at this point. Pontius Pilate was unable to restore order to his territory, that is, Judea. The legate of Syria, Pilate's superior, was growing increasingly intolerant. This was Vitellius, who had been in office for 2 years. Vitellius took advantage of a Samaritan massacre. He had Emperor Tiberius summon Pilate to Rome in order to dismiss him. Vitellius then removed the high priest Caiaphas from office, thus killing 2 birds with 1 stone. AD 36 to 38. After this, the religious climate of Israel was relatively quiet. Nothing special happened in Jerusalem, while the dispersed apostles and disciples were working marvels. Manaen was doing particularly well in Syria. AD 37 to 41. A king was gradually established over all Palestine. It was Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great and Herodias' brother. In AD 37, Emperor Caligula gave him Philip's former territory in northern Transjordania. Caligula then granted him Galilee and Perea in AD 39. These had belonged to Agrippa's uncle Herod Antipas, the one who executed John the Baptist. Antipas had just been stripped of everything and was exiled to Gaul. Finally, Emperor Claudius, shortly after succeeding Caligula, gave Herod Agrippa I sovereignty over Idumea, Judea, and Samaria. Thus, in AD 41, Herod Agrippa I ruled over all of Palestine, like his grandfather. AD 41. Manaen was doing so well in Syria that Barnabas was sent to help him set up a local church in Antioch. This was the first church outside of Jerusalem. AD 42. Barnabas, again, these are all of them have asterisks because they don't come from Maria Volturna's writings. AD 42. Barnabas sent to Tarsus for Paul. They stayed in Antioch for a year until the spring. AD 43. Springtime. Paul and Barnabas went to Jerusalem briefly. Footnote 10. Acts chapter 11, verse 19 to 30. By then, Herod Agrippa I had begun to use his power to launch an open, fierce persecution of Christ's disciples. After all, his family, especially his sister Herodias, had always hated Jesus' followers. Lazarus and his sisters probably left about this time to evangelize in foreign lands. James the Great, John's brother, was the first of the apostles to be martyred. He had just returned from an apostolic trip to the other end of the Mediterranean Sea. Peter was arrested, but he managed to escape, as Scripture tells us. Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 18. After this, Peter remembered something Jesus had said before Lazarus' death. Acting on it, he went into Caesar's very den, Rome. Eusebius of Caesarea tells us in his church history that this happened during the first years of Claudius's reign. At this time, universal providence sent the great, valiant apostle Peter to Rome, bringing the message of the kingdom of heaven to the men of the West. Peter's first contact with Rome did not last very long. AD 44, April. Asterisk. The persecutor of Christians, Herod Agrippa I, died in Caesarea. For this reason, Peter returned to Jerusalem. At this time, Rabbi Gamaliel re-entered the scene. The seed of Christianity had been sown in him on the tragic Holy Friday when the temple veil was rent. Planted into the soil of remorse at the foot of the cross, warmed up by the fiery words of the apostles and best disciples, and watered by the blood of martyrs, beginning with his own disciple Stephen, and more recently James the apostle. The seed of Christianity was finally ready to sprout in his heart. Gamaliel was now old and totally blind. John the apostle was a fully developed man. Mary's pure and fresh beauty was not altered by age, even though she was nearly 64 years old. One evening, Mary was spinning and John was finishing up some maintenance work. Suddenly, Gamaliel, led by a servant, arrived at the little house of Gethsemane. He still did not dare come to the apostles. He came to receive light, wisdom, truth, and life from the Mother of God. John offered to lead him to Peter, and Gamaliel immediately accepted. After this, he retired for the rest of his life in his home in Gishkala. He was in his early 70s and would die in peace and God's grace. About this time, Paul set off on his first apostolic journey in Asia Minor. He first went to Cyprus, then to Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Footnote 12, Acts chapter 13, verses 1 through 26. About the same time, Matthew began writing his gospel in Aramaic. AD 48. Paul returned to Antioch of Syria with Barnabas, who had accompanied him. Circumcision had become a major problem. Now, as we saw at the time of Stephen's martyrdom, Paul was a man of radical solutions. No wonder he became a fierce advocate of everyone's freedom when dealing with circumcision. AD 49. The elders of the church of Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem. They would meet with the apostles and the elders of the earliest church to settle this issue. This has often been pompously called the First Council of Jerusalem. Actually, only Peter, James the Less, and John were present. The other apostles were still evangelizing in foreign lands. Again, all of this is asterisks. It does not occur in the writings of Maria Valtorta. The difficult meeting, footnote 13, Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 21, lasted from April to June, but probably occurred in two sessions. First, the apostles and the elders of the local church discussed this among themselves. Then there was a larger gathering. At this time, James ruled that it was definitely not essential for pagan converts to be circumcised. AD 50, against asterisk. Paul, who had returned to Antioch, now set off for his second journey. He was going to Europe for the first time. AD 51. In April, Paul put out to sea from Troas, the former Troy, and sailed for Samothrace. Excuse me. Now, AD 51 was a turning point for Christ's church in many regards. Since Emperor Claudius had decided to expel all Jews from Rome, most of them left in AD 51. Suetonius wrote that the authorities saw that the Jews were agitated by a certain Christus, that is Christ. This enabled all the Jewish Christians of Rome to spread the good news throughout the empire. Paul, as we have just seen, began his great missionary thrust into the Mediterranean basin. Finally, and most importantly, the Lord decided to bring Mary to himself. She was his pure and unique handmaid. He had made her the immaculate mother of his son, and she had filled him with joy. One morning, Mary felt that her hour had come. After more than 20 years of peaceful existence with John in Lazarus' house at Gethsemane, she took the precious relics of Jesus' passion to kiss them one last time. After putting them away, she lay down on her bed. Her eyes shone with extraordinary joy. She said to John, "Now everything has been fulfilled. The church is strong. The Holy Spirit enlightens it. The blood of the first martyrs is consolidating and multiplying it. I have been able to help it to become a holy, living body. Charity towards the brethren strengthens it evermore and gives it spiritual nourishment. May all of you, to the end of times, remember everything my Son has done and said, and do it, and write it down so it might be preserved for all generations until the end of centuries. The Spirit of God will help you all to do this." Then she gave John her last order, not to embalm her immaculate body. John was overwhelmed. His parents had died, and he was going to lose the one who was more than a mother to him. He was going to lose his last human link with Jesus. They spoke about the light of God and all that God had done for them. Evening arrived, and the Sabbath was beginning. Mary said to John, "I am in God, and God is in me. As I contemplate him and feel his embrace, recite the psalm and some other scriptures. The Spirit of wisdom will tell you which ones." John held back the tears welling up from his heart and began singing the psalms as requested of him. He moved on to recite the Magnificat. He had not even finished when he realized that the spirit of Mary had left him. Mary still had a smile on her face, and she looked calm and peaceful. John grieved deeply for a while. He then went out to pick some flowers and cut olive boughs, placed them around Mary, and began keeping watch over her. He kept watch for 3 days. On the dawn of the 4th day, John, overcome with exhaustion, had fallen asleep. A great light suddenly filled the room. It was the same indescribable light that had shone at the Annunciation, Pentecost, and Jesus' birth and resurrection. At this, Mary's body, still sleeping, began to rise towards heaven. John awoke and, utterly delighted, marveled at the sight of the Virgin Mary awaking as she was assumed into heaven. She went to meet the incarnate Word who was waiting for her, and disappeared with him from the apostles' sight into the rays of the rising sun. Footnote 14. According to Maria Valtorta's revelations, Mary's assumption took place in 2 stages: the dormition, or falling asleep of her body. At this time, Mary's spirit was lifted into heaven. The assumption proper, when Mary's body was awakened, assumed into heaven, and joined back to her spirit. Regarding the date of Mary's assumption, A. Maria Valtorta quoted Jesus saying that his mother would remain on earth 21 more years after him. B. She said that the dormition began on a Sabbath evening, a Friday night, and that John immediately set out to pick olive boughs on which olives were already formed. This indicated that it was summer. C. She also wrote that John stayed awake for 3 days, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, before the actual Assumption, on the dawn of the 4th day, a Tuesday. Now the feast of the Assumption falls on August the 15th in the Gregorian calendar, and if we determine which day of the week this was in AD 51, we discover that it was a Tuesday. Is this really just a coincidence? Mary, spouse of God and mother of Christ, had been the last physical, tangible link with Christ. The apostles needed her maternal help in their new, stuttering Christian faith. By now, though, they were sufficiently rooted. 2,000 years of hindsight confirms this. Christ's church was able to develop as its founder wanted it to. Asterisk. Jesus commissioned his church to evangelize. It was already very busy evangelizing by the time Mary was assumed into heaven. Peter ceaselessly went from place to place. However, James the Less remained in Jerusalem, alone in charge of the local flock. Now we know this was not easy. Considering the martyrdom of Stephen and James the Great, John's brother, Matthew was spreading the word in Galilee and northern Palestine as far as Syria, an area he well knew. Various traditions have it that Andrew evangelized as far as the Ukraine and Crimea, and that Thomas went east to the country of the Parthians, as far as northeast India. The other survivors among the 12, along with many disciples, brought the word to the outreaches of the Roman Empire and beyond. Asterisk. Paul, in particular, from AD 51 onwards, devoted himself to his missionary vocation. His understanding of Christ and vibrant faith would work marvels. Again, asterisk. After evangelizing in Macedonia, Paul left with his little group of disciples. These were Silas, Timothy, and all those he mentions in his epistles throughout the years. They went to Thessalonica and pushed on to Athens in the fall of AD 51. Paul did not remain there very long and arrived in Corinth by the end of the year. There he met Aquila and his wife Priscilla, who had come over from Rome as a result of Claudius's decree. Corinth was awash with money at that time. It was a den of dissolute living and luxury. The population was about 500,000, and 2/3 of them were slaves. AD 53 to 54. Peter went through Corinth sometime between April of AD 53 and September of AD 54. However, since Paul had left Corinth in April of AD 53, the two did not meet. Peter was on his way to Rome. The pontiff called by Jesus was going to set up in Rome the eternal see of Christ's church. As for Paul, he returned to Palestine. Shortly afterwards, in September or October of AD 53, he left Antioch of Syria for his third journey. 1 year later, in October of AD 54, he established himself in Ephesus. AD 57. Paul left Ephesus for Macedonia around Pentecost. He was planning a large collection for the church of Jerusalem, which was very badly off at the time. Besides the persecutions of Christians, there was a famine. Paul set out for Macedonia and spent the winter in Corinth. AD 58. Again, all of what follows is not in Maria Valtorta's writings. AD 58, springtime. Paul returned to Macedonia. There he met Luke in time to celebrate Easter. After this, he sailed to Jerusalem for Pentecost. This was another turning point for Paul. Fiery as he was, he did not hesitate to face his former co-disciples and masters right in the temple. The Roman soldiers had to intervene forcefully to protect him from his enraged enemies. After this, the Romans decided to bring him over to Caesarea because Paul was a Roman citizen from Tarsus. Now Caesarea is where the governor Felix resided. Although Felix treated Paul very liberally, he kept him in custody for 2 years. This is the earliest possible date at which John established himself in Ephesus. We now know that the one who called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved was a great mystic. Remembering John the Baptist's words, he was the first disciple to recognize Jesus as the Lamb of God. He was the first apostle to understand that Jesus was God. Since he resided a long time with the Lord's mother, he was the first also to understand the cosmic dimension of the Son of God. Jesus is the one through whom everything has been made. At the same time, John was the church's first contemplative and the first to carefully guard the doctrine. After Mary's Assumption, John remained living as a hermit for a short time. He kept in touch with Peter for a year or two, as well as with James the Less. As the years passed, Jerusalem gradually lost its importance, and John decided to leave. By now, some Christians were beginning to misinterpret Jesus' deeds and some facts concerning him. John felt that there was a need to set the record straight. He decided to write a faithful rendering of Jesus' life and teachings, appropriate for future generations. John dealt a great deal with the transcendental aspect of the coming of the Son in human form. John needed some hindsight and peace to think about this irreplaceable message. At this point, he chose to settle in Ephesus. From there, it was easy to communicate with Rome, Greece, and the whole Middle East. AD 60. When the new governor, Festus, came to Caesarea, he began to try Paul. During the trial, Festus asked him if he wanted to be brought before the Sanhedrin. Instead, Paul appealed to Caesar. Footnote 15, Acts 25, verses 6 to 12. This was his right, since he was a Roman citizen. As a result of appealing to the emperor, he had to be transferred to Rome under guard. In the fall, he put to sea. It was a difficult journey. The ship was in distress and ran aground in Malta. Paul, his guards, and the other companions wintered there. AD 61. They set off again in March. They put into port in Sicily and disembarked at Puteoli. Emperor Nero, at this time, was beginning to put some pressure on the young Christian sect. which was accused of foreign superstitions. The chief priests did not fail to notice. AD 62. Paul waited under guard for his trial in Rome. He was still allowed to teach. Meanwhile, Festus died, and the high priest and his confederates took advantage of the interregnum to massacre James the Less, bishop of Jerusalem, and several Jewish Christians. AD 63. Paul was imprisoned. Since he was just about to be tried, his trial took place shortly afterwards, and Paul hoped to be freed in late 63 or early AD 64. As Tertullian says, Nero had not yet institutionalized his persecution of Christians, so that Paul was delivered from the lion's mouth. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 17. Now is the time to say something about Paul's relationship with Peter. The least that can be said of these strong personalities is that they had very little in common besides their faith. Actually, both of them were much more interested in their own missions than in trying to be close to one another. Paul, of course, respected Peter as a pillar of the church, Galatians chapter 2, verse 7, but he himself had received his mission directly from the Lord. He dedicated himself to evangelizing everywhere. Peter, however, had been instituted supreme pastor of the flock 3 times, as we have seen. His particular vocation was to implant the seat of the church in the capital of the empire. He began devoting himself to the Church of Rome in the 60s. As history reveals, the one in charge of this church was going to be the lighthouse of Christianity throughout the centuries. AD 64. Paul left the capital of the empire. He no longer had anything to do there. In this way, he was able to avoid the slaughter that befell Christians after the immense fire in Rome. He then went to the limits of the Occident, in the words of Pope Clement, to the Corinthians. He wrote this in AD 96. Paul's journey to Spain probably took the rest of the year. He probably stopped over in main cities on the way, especially Massilia. Footnote 16. Massilia was a port in what is now southern France. It is now called Marseille. Editor. Massilia had a large Christian community. It had been founded some 10 to 15 years earlier by some disciples who had been taught by Jesus himself. Meanwhile, Peter and thousands of Christians were martyred by Emperor Nero, who conceived the most abominable tortures. After this, Paul returned east. AD 65. Linus succeeded Peter as Bishop of Rome. Paul began visiting the local churches of Crete and Asia Minor. He wintered in Nicopolis on the western coast of Greece. AD 66. Paul was arrested in early AD 66, just as he disembarked in Asia Minor. He was transferred to Rome again. By this time, Nero's judicial machine was in full force against Christians. Paul was chained up and put in solitary confinement. Meanwhile, the first signs that Jesus had prophesied about the fall of the temple were occurring in Jerusalem. The aristocracy, that is, the Sadducees, spearheaded an uprising against the rule of the Romans. The Christian community of Jerusalem still had not recovered from recent persecutions, nor the martyrdom of James and his companions in the year 62. For this reason, at the first signs of insurrection, the Christians, guided by the Holy Spirit, decided to leave the city. They took refuge at Pella, on the east bank of the Jordan River. Jesus' desires were fulfilled. His cousin Simon became the community leader, though he did not bear an official title. The Jews clashed violently with one another and with the Roman troops that sought to reestablish peace and order. After this, things quickly deteriorated. AD 67, Paul was beheaded, probably in the fall. As for Vespasian, the Roman general, he led the army towards Palestine. AD 68, Vespasian had just arrived next to Jerusalem when Nero died. Galba became emperor for a short while. AD 69, Vespasian abandoned the siege of Jerusalem to become the next emperor. This gave the Jews a chance to gather their strength and fortify their city. This, however, only caused them to perish more quickly, as was their destiny. God's ways are indeed unfathomable. AD 70, Vespasian's son Titus attacked Jerusalem when it was full of pilgrims for the Passover. He flew into a rage when the inhabitants doggedly resisted. When he finally overcame them, his soldiers set the temple on fire. According to Flavius Josephus, the historian, this occurred on August 10th. Vespasian did not leave a stone standing and ordered a horrible slaughter. as Jesus had predicted.